All right, so good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to all of our friends tuning in from across the United States and from around the world. Welcome to our second Future of Innovation Live podcast event. So happy to have all of you here. I am so excited because smart cities is where I live and all the stuff I'm really interested in. So today's session features a really informative and incredible deep dive into the future of smart cities. I am your host, Brian Anselin, Program Manager at LineRun. And we are very excited to have four incredibly innovative entrepreneurs joining us this evening to share their insight and perspective on the future of smart cities. They include Jatish Patel, the founder and CEO of Flow Labs, Reza Alaghehband, CEO at Envio Systems, Sandra Richter, CEO and co-founder of Soofa, and Tiffany Chu, CEO and co-founder of Remix. And as a special treat, we also have a co-host this evening, and he is David Hall. He's the managing partner at Fleet Modem, a ground transport fleet and technology consultancy. So great panelist, great audience. But before we get into the conversation, let's talk a little bit about us for a second. LineRun is an experiential career and industry education platform for tomorrow's workforce. We empower our community of leaders to connect, innovate, and grow through media, events, and programs such as today's session. We invite you to check out our website, www.linerun.co, to learn more about our podcasts, classes, and career accelerator programs. So that is LineRun. With that, with all the spiel completed, we're going to start with our one-on-one spotlights and go straight to Jatish. So Jatish, so glad to have you with us. Hot button issue today involves how to balance the need for greater equality in how streets and roads are being shared by vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists, what have you not, while trying to accommodate the growing volume and congestion on city streets around the world. How can AI help cities maintain this delicate balance, and how does Flow Labs factor into that equation in a post-COVID world?
Thanks, Brian, for that question. Thanks for having me. At Flow Labs, we don't think about it as equality per se. We think about it as being about balancing objectives, especially as the world is constantly changing. Over the last few years, we've seen cities place a greater emphasis on non-automotive transportation modes, for example, bicycles and pedestrians. For example, we're seeing more cycle lanes being built. We're seeing more roads being pedestrianized. We're also seeing a greater focus on managing environmental impacts, such as reducing vehicle emissions and carbon footprints. These are great trends which demonstrate that cities are finally beginning to think about the flow of people as opposed to the flow of vehicles. And they're also taking into account environmental impact in decision making. Now, there have been a couple of things that historically have been holding cities back and still hold them back today. Number one is, as with most groups, cities can often bias decisions towards where they have data. And it's been very easy to get data on vehicle flows from inductive loops and other IoT sensors. But for pedestrians and bicycles, that data hasn't really been there historically. Now, connected devices, especially the smartphone, is really beginning to change that. Everyone now has a sensor in their pocket, and it provides a new data set which can be mined for insight. Now, today, there's still a gap between the data available for pedestrians and bicycles versus vehicles, but this gap is closing, and we're really excited about the work that's being done in this space. Another thing is that's holding cities back is that they are highly reliant on people to be able to make a lot of these complex decisions with more data that they can really handle. Now, let's take a problem that we're heavily focused on, traffic signal control. Now, whilst everyone sees simple red, yellow, and green lights, this is actually a very, very difficult decision to make, where you have to balance a number of different objectives from safety, mobility, user experience, transit priority. And now add to that environmental impact and other multimodal considerations. And to add even more complexity, that balance of objectives can change by intersection or by region. And at the same intersection, they can change by time of day or even throughout the year. So just imagine if you're the traffic engineer sitting in between petabytes and petabytes of unprocessed data and the complexity of this massive decision. And that's where we at Flow Labs come in, and that's where our AI really changes things for these engineers. We initially use AI to ingest, process, and fuse all of these disparate data sets to drive incredible and unprecedented insight into what is happening in and around roadways. Our AI then enables transport engineers to set the balance of objectives that they think is correct for their city, then optimize for those objectives, predict outcomes, and then measure those outcomes using real world data. Today, we're highly focused on traffic signal control and helping cities to do it effectively and autonomously. But in the future, we'll be using the same technology architecture to help cities make even more impactful decisions, like where to build new roads, how to adjust transit schedules, dynamic speed limiting, and how to route people more effectively. Now, talking about as a post-COVID world, COVID is obviously an evolving situation, and cities have already made a lot of decisions and changes to how they operate transport systems. For example, pedestrianizing certain roads. It's also impacting user behavior. Obviously, people are traveling less right now, but also people are shifting the way that they travel and shifting away from mass transit almost entirely. So the truth is, we can all sit here and speculate about what is going to happen, but we really don't know, and we don't know what's coming around the corner. And it's important to acknowledge that the world is changing more rapidly than ever, and AI-driven autonomous technologies like what we provide at Flow Labs can help cities make decisions fast enough to keep up with those changes and accommodate new goals as they develop. So in short, AI technologies like our own are enabling a world where cities can be more agnostic to the goals and objectives for their transport decisions. They can be agnostic to the scale of the data. They can be agnostic to the complexity of the problem, and they can be agnostic to the time frame on which decisions can be made.
Thanks, Jatish. That was great. And I'd like to thank the 4 panelists that we have today. They're great, and everyone who's participating. We'll segue from Jatish to Sandra. Sandra, my question is for you. One of the more notable outcomes to come out of the pandemic has been greater appreciation of our outdoor spaces and the efforts to democratize their use. How does the intersection of information, infrastructure, and IoT help shape the future management of those spaces? And how will Soofa grow into this new reality as a community partner?
Thanks so much for that question. When I read that question, I was actually taken back to my days at the MIT Media Lab, where we had a city science seminar where we all dreamed about streets that would adjust by time of day, depending on what people needed. And it seemed at the time so far away that a street would turn all pedestrian, all bicycles, all cars, depending on time of day. And I feel like now, through COVID, we're actually seeing that happening, at least here where we're based in Cambridge, Mass. It's been incredible to see how quickly government and small businesses have come together to create pop-up restaurants, for example. And so they have now, in a very agile way, opened and closed roads or made them one-way or two-way. So to your point of democratization, I think it's really also back to Jatish's point, what is the objective at the time? How can we optimize space? Space in city is limited. And how can we optimize for community building, for making sure that we're having happy, healthy, sustainable lives within cities? And I think one part that's really important and that sometimes is overlooked, and that's where Soofa really comes into play, is communication. So once an infrastructure change happens, how do people know about it? Once Tiffany and Remix figure out what the best route for a bus or just generally public transportation is, like, how do people know? And so with Soofa, we built a neighborhood news feed that has screens that everyone can see and anyone can use. So it's really about building out a public infrastructure that can be self-funded that allows people to figure out what matters in that very specific geo. And so that might be that this is a shared street during the hours of X and Y, and this is happening right now, versus, you know, tomorrow is a farmer's market that's happening here, you should be coming. So I think it's really both about the infrastructure and the IoT that is enabling knowing what's going on and being able to communicate that, but then really looping in the human and making sure that the human actually knows what's going on, because there really is too many complex, you know, processes happening all at once within the smart city, and that I'm personally really excited about to see moving forward. And I think, you know, even further into the future, thinking about autonomous cars and infrastructure getting even more smart, we want to make sure that we keep the human element and communicate with people, and also give them a voice to communicate back into their neighborhood, which is really what matters. And I think, and that's going to be my last point on this, one thing that's also happened through COVID, I would have said, is a real, at least in the US, a dream come true for a lot of people around what does the neighborhood actually mean. Kent Larson, the head of the Smart Cities group at MIT, has really been, together with his predecessor Bill, thought about the 5-minute radius city. Like, how do we make sure we have everything we need around us and that we can actually get to, so that congestion doesn't even happen. And I think we're seeing that now. People are staying in their neighborhood and people are out and about, and I think that's great. And I hope that that's something that we can keep in the hopefully soon post-COVID world.
Sandra, that's really great insight. And I love the fact that you brought up the real process of trying to humanize these technologies and innovations, especially with how physical spaces and how they're being managed and developed. The lines are really blurring, and the stakeholders' needs are shifting in real time. And it's really important that we try to understand what's going on in this space, because ultimately it will help shape what we see in our cities in the future. And talking about building infrastructure, it's of real particular interest to a lot of different stakeholders, particularly when we talk about real estate and commercial companies who bring their people and their businesses to these cities. And I think this is where we find Reza and his team. And, you know, looping Reza in on this, environmentally friendly policies through efficient energy consumption in commercial real estate was really top of mind for many people prior to the pandemic. Obviously, with the pandemic, put a hold on a lot of things, but how has the work from home movement challenged corporations pursuing these initiatives within their building infrastructure, and how has Envio responded to these changes? Reza, I think we're losing you on the audio.
Was I on mute?
Yeah.
Okay, I was on double mute. So thanks a lot, Brian, for having me. I appreciate it. That's actually a really fascinating question. We've been dramatically impacted by this, and we get to see really firsthand how really both businesses who are having to adapt their operations to the real estate owners and operators. One of the unique things in what we do is it had positioned us to be able to provide capabilities and functionalities that weren't available within commercial buildings before, allowing the buildings to adapt to these conditions. Within our system, one of the core value propositions in what we do has been energy efficiency. What happens is, rather than the savings of dollars, the priority turned into what does this mean for us moving forward by the companies that are actually leasing the real estate. And for them, that meant we need solutions that, you know, provide more than just energy savings and put a focus on health and wellness. And they came to us asking what was possible. So we ran into quite a few scenarios. Initially, one of the biggest ones was, okay, we have our entire building being shut down. It's completely empty. We don't want to run it on the same sequences, controls, and schedules as before. We have mandates where people can't go out. How do we actually turn down or tune down our buildings? And these are for large commercial buildings, which, you know, have bills over 100,000 a month, shopping malls, which have hundreds of thousands of dollars in utility bills per month. We had the benefit of having the ones that we'd installed in, giving them the capability to actually begin remotely adjusting the configurations of the building, the set points, the on and off times, and making them reactive to what the occupancy is actually going to be, resulting in, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars saved from clients at a low ballpark. But then the other capabilities that we've introduced and adapted for, this was completely, obviously unprecedented, but we'd been previously, even before this one, receiving a lot of interest and a lot of demand in how do we make our buildings healthier? How do we make them more intelligent? And what do we do? So our technology was designed into not just optimizing the building operations. We measure health and wellness and send them a report even before any of this happened. So that includes being able to measure the VOCs in the air, being able to measure the CO2. And instead of making it a very complex process, what we've done is actually make it so that they can take third-party indoor air quality sensors and just plug them in to the building, and then we can enable that, giving them alerts on what is going on, being able to connect with the tenants that are within each individual room, letting them know if there is too much CO2, if the air quality is good or not within that space, so that it can actually be reactive infrastructure around people. So not only that, but we ended up going a couple of steps further by beginning to, we have an app store for commercial buildings. So what happens is we've begun looking at technologies that promote personal space distancing, so that with a couple of clicks, you can actually monitor it and let you know how many people are within that space, how far apart they are from each other. As well as we have a partnership with one of the world's largest manufacturers of fans and motors. And we collaborated with them and the certification body for indoor air quality called Reset, so I'll give them a shout out there. And we're developing a real-time indoor air quality viral load value that tells you, and then makes the building actually adapt to the different conditions, because you don't run into the same conditions with different types of diseases. So one of them, you may have to adapt the building operations, humidity up, temperature down. You may have to do ventilation cycles faster because you need to get the fresh air out. And so we have to create the buildings and make them more adaptive. And one of the big things is, now that people are actually returning to work, there are conditions that people must abide by. For this specific instance in COVID, we're able to override the existing programming controls at a couple of clicks of a button to be able to implement COVID programming within the buildings, to have them run on fresh air ventilation continuously, to be able to meet legal mandates that are required for that. It's been quite interesting in terms of adapting. And on the other point of how are we seeing the difference in the work from home kind of aspect to it, we're seeing that the clients that we have in the major companies that we work with, they want, rather than saying this is something that we have to adapt to, everybody wants to go home, they're looking at it as an opportunity to utilize the space more efficiently. So they're looking for optimizing and adapting indoor space to the conditions and having kind of an open kind of format so people can sit wherever they want on, you know, day-to-day basis. So they need technologies to kind of adapt to that and make it available, which is something else we've kind of begun working on in collaboration with them. Does that answer your question? Great.
Yeah, well, that's great, Rez. It's really interesting stuff, the progression of data and everything. I mean, of all of our panelists, though, the one I'm really excited about is Tiffany, because I've been in bus scheduling for about 30 years. And I remember with bus scheduling, we used to take printouts, literal printouts, and key the data into a spreadsheet and then do analysis. So seeing what she can do with this data, what all of you can do, is just really incredible. So Tiffany, my question is for you. It's safe to say that the global health crisis has completely upended public transportation around the world, which upended might actually be an understatement, calling into question not only its primary role of facilitating the safe movement of people, but also its financial viability. How can transit agencies adapt to this new normal to serve the riding public, and how has Remix started to guide them through the process?
Extremely topical and kind of heart-wrenching question right now for the transportation industry, David. I think it's notable that you said we used to do scheduling with paper and pencil, and I actually think that's actually how a lot of agencies still do some of their scheduling and planning. So it's not too far from today, honestly. Specifically with COVID. So taking a step back, Remix is a collaborative software platform for transportation decision-making. We help about 350 different agencies and cities around the world do everything from plan out their public transit networks, design safer streets, help them manage their shared bike share and micromobility programs. And what we've seen, especially in kind of the March to April timeframe, was the most scenario planning of any time frame we've ever seen in the usage of the Remix platform. And the reason was because most of our agencies were just cutting service by, you know, ridership was dropping 70 to 90%. So a lot of them had to cut service to, you know, 40, 30, 20% of what they typically carry. Specifically in San Francisco, where Remix is based, we saw the SFMTA cut their routes from 89 to about 17 routes over the course of a weekend, and they had to plan for 10 different scenarios because they didn't know how people were going to respond to in terms of ridership. In New York, we were working with the MTA, and also over the course of 48 hours of a weekend, the agency decided to shut down their subway system from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. for the first time in MTA history for extended cleaning. And the operations and planning departments used Remix to plan out unprecedented overnight bus service across the service area, specifically focusing on essential workers, because even though us who may be privileged being able to do their job and make money while sitting behind our laptops, a lot of people who depend on public transit don't have that privilege. And so the public transit agencies are still delivering an essential service themselves to get hospital workers to and from their jobs, grocery store workers, pharmacy workers, etc. And due to our inability to wear masks in many parts of the US, I think that issue has been exacerbated by the federal government. And so the funding that's needed to keep transit running throughout the pandemic to remain stable and financially viable beyond, a lot of agencies are on the brink of a fiscal cliff, and it's a really big catastrophe right now. I would say on the slightly more optimistic side, it's been a real, I guess, I don't know, the word is it's been a pleasant surprise to see how quickly cities have been adapting to COVID beyond just kind of the public transit situation that we have. And Sandra touched upon this with the amount of experimentation that we're seeing cities do right now with opening up their streets for people, prioritizing pedestrians. opening up streets for economic recovery, honestly, with their ability to have restaurant space and small business space out in a place where, typically is reserved for parking. So I think that's been a real positive jolt of energy through the transportation world right now, to see how quickly cities can move, how quickly cities, especially in Europe, have been investing in sustainable modes like bike lanes and bike infrastructure. And we're seeing a lot of that happen in Remix as well. So there's been heartbreak, and then there's also a little bit of silver lining too.
Definitely think that's right. It's heartbreak slash silver lining slash opportunity. And as a point of reference, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but I'm in New York right now. I am around the corner from a bus stop that was just added based on the planners at the MTA using the Remix platform. So,
oh,
yeah,
great example.
it is a great example. And I really appreciate all of you sharing your individual perspectives on this, and transitioning to a more general panel discussion and having everyone jump in. We'll start with Sandra here with this. Lots of things coming out in terms of smart city technology, especially with the interruption with general business and life overall. What are the top 3 trends that you see influencing the future of smart cities over the next 2 to 3 years as we move forward into the new normal?
Well, thanks so much for the question. Also, Tiffany, I wanted to say, I think your work is really incredible, and I think it's so awesome how you're making all those plans for everybody, in particular getting essential workers from A to B. So I'm really proud to know you as a friend as well. So thanks for the great work. In terms of trends, I think we could get very hung up on COVID, and I think about all the trends coming out of COVID. For example, everybody's moving outside of the city. We're going to see a new suburbia emerge. I'm a bit hesitant to believe that we will have long-lasting behavioral changes through COVID. Looking back at influenza or the Spanish flu, once vaccines are available, I believe that we will very quickly forget. And so that's why I was saying earlier, I hope things like opening our streets will be here to stay. But I think it's much more likely that the trends that we have seen will continue to shape the future of the smart city. And so I think what Jatish was talking about with AI is definitely here to stay, and will shape our future. We have much more possibilities, not only to gather data and to quickly analyze, but now also to react. So I think that is really, the responsive city is one of the trends that I would mention here as my number one. I think the second is we have already pre-COVID with co-working seen a dispersed workforce, and I think this will just accelerate through what we're seeing right now. So I think decentralized city management in smaller pockets of neighborhoods that are connected, I would say, is the second smart city trends. And with that, micromobility and being able to have lower vehicle owner share. And I think Uber will also be coming back. So that's why I say, like, there's some things I just don't think are going to go away. And then maybe someone from the group wants to add their first to be my third, and then we can kind of kick it off that way.
I think Jatish, you wanted to add a couple things.
Unfortunately, I'm not adding anything new. Sandra really covered a lot of it, so I guess great minds think alike. I was going to say that, yeah, for us, obviously, as an AI company, AI is number one trend, and obviously, a lot of the data is already here, and decision making has seemed to be the bottleneck right now. And AI is going to dramatically change how we can utilize all of that data and the speed at which we can do it. But also what's been really interesting to see, having come from the IoT world in the UK, is that actually we saw the adoption of IoT really slow down towards kind of the middle of the last decade, just because even when the data was here, it's very difficult to make any use of it. So we think that now this new AI wave will also kind of unlock the value and the ROI in generating data and really unleash that kind of IoT trend all over again.
Definitely. And Sandra, just picking up from where Jatish left off, did you want to add your third, or is it that just move forward with, the AI and how it's going to change everything?
I mean, I can add a hopeful trend that I think, all of us want to see, which is social cities. I mean, I think, within my intro, I made very clear how important humanization of the smart city is and how often, when we go to smart city conferences, it's all about infrastructure and data. And I think it's very important. But understanding human behavior and really building a smart city that can foster the good in life, and to Reza's point earlier, like thinking about the health and well-being and like how do we bring that into the smart city is a trend that I would like to see more of.
All right, we'll go to Reza with the next question. Obviously, COVID, the pandemic has dramatically impacted, everybody on the entire planet pretty much. So the question will be, how's it impacted the proliferation and adoption of IoT and smart cities and the progress you were making before the pandemic?
Great, I'm unmuted already. So we've ran into a surprising trend in doing this. For a lot of the real estate sector, it's changed the priorities of people of what they're looking at and the budgets that people are looking to spend. Having a huge economic downturn turns people to slashing budgets and switching over to the key essentials. For some of them, for other ones, adopting and being able to focus on the priorities that are the people has been a huge advantage. So some IoT technologies that have applied to people counting have gotten a big boost. IoT technologies for measurement of indoor air quality, environmental things like that have gotten a huge boost. Other ones that have been kind of dropped have been the ones that aren't directly ROI related, and they're not health and wellness related. So it's actually bringing people on board to adopt different types of technologies, not really less or slow down.
That's interesting, very interesting. Jatish, let's go to you for your perspective here on, has this affected the adoption of your technology?
Yeah, I guess giving a bit more of an outdoor and road-based perspective, for us, what we've seen is that the COVID situation has made it clear to everyone how rapidly and almost aggressively the world can change. And what we've seen as well historically is that what we call the iteration loop for a city can be extremely long for any decision. The amount of time to collect data, to process it, to make a decision based on it, and then to execute on that decision is in the span of years for most transport decisions. And IoT and AI is obviously helpful with this. What we're seeing is an appetite to accelerate adoption of IoT and AI solutions, but then right now in this current situation, there's the financial realities of where agencies are today, which is inhibiting some investments. The major issue with a lot of IoT solutions, especially for roadways, is that they can typically be cost additive rather than cost saving. So not only do they entail deployment costs, but also require constant maintenance as well. On the other hand, AI solutions like our own can be cost reductive, so they don't face this same hurdle, and they're better at exploiting the data that is already available today. So yeah, overall, we're seeing an increased appetite, but the ability is not quite there. It's a little bit better for AI solutions than IoT.
It's great that you bring that up, because how these technologies are really affecting both cities and then, the secondary destinations, so suburbs and Main Street America, it's on varying levels, even though it's a lot of the same issues. And I think this really brings up how this global interruption of business has really affected this trickle-down effect from the large metropolitan areas into more suburbia and rural towns. And Tiffany, we'd love to go to you first here. What additional obstacles have you faced with Remix as a result of the global pandemic to bring your technology, your solutions to, those smaller communities, the ones that aren't the New York or the San Francisco or the Seattle with the bright lights? What kind of obstacles have you faced as a result of what's going on today?
So if I were to rewind back to, say, March, April, and everybody was starting to work from home, there were a good handful of our city customers and agency customers who just didn't even have laptops to work from home, for the first 2 or 3 weeks. Like, their IT department was scrambling, they were trying to get equipment to all of their staff. And, as opposed to a lot of startups where literally instead of just going into the office, we just went and sat at our dining room tables. Like, the transition that the public sector needs to make in order to get to the level of, remote work functionality and efficiency and everything is just a very, very large gap. So what we were able to see is that we were, somewhat helpful in helping them move to a more cloud-based collaborative software platform, which we appreciate being able to help in that way. But I think in terms of bringing startup technologies to Main Street America, I think a lot of startups should obviously just start with what problem are we solving, or are we a solution in search of a problem? And when I think about when I talk to other startup founders who are just getting started, one of the quotes that spoke to me the most when we were just starting out at Remix is, I think the founder of Box said, the solution that wins is the one that bridges your customers to the future as opposed to forcing them to take a giant leap. And I think that's extremely true today, and it will continue to be if the public and private sectors continue diverging in their pace of innovation.
And speaking of how to align those solutions with the individual areas, Sandra, how has your process been affected, and how have you tried to reach these smaller towns and cities through this situation?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I'm actually very proud of our team that we've been able to mobilize very quickly and respond, both in terms of getting more public screens into small towns very quickly, and then also just changing the content, basically almost like an app store where we were able to show public special announcements. And my team has really done phenomenal job. So if anybody from Soofa is listening in, you guys are the best. I know that was a lot of hard work. And so I would say that in terms of bringing technology to main streets in America, to Tiffany's question, first of all, is like, what is the problem we're solving for? But then I do think there is a real reality where small towns have similar problems to big towns, but they have less money. And so I think one of the big challenges of the smart city is that oftentimes the big flashy cities get the attention from investors or startups and big companies to make it a showcase. Like the smart city showcase is always a great thing. And quite frankly, often it's not the most democratized approach to bring technology to the places where they're needed the most. And so one thing that I would like to encourage here for anybody who is working on smart city projects or just generally on betterment of cities and trying to bring that to every main street is really thinking through how can something be self-funded. And I think, Big Belly actually as a trash can compactor, it's not the sexiest of topics, but it's actually something that, trash collection is a very important piece to cities. And so they found a way of making it self-fundable for a lot of communities and being able to deploy at scale. And I think similarly, we're seeing that now with micromobility and thinking through how can we subsidize or build new business models that allow for technology and just, you know, services that can help to be brought to everyone. And that's definitely something that Soofa stands for, and that we take very seriously. And we sometimes cross finance. So somewhere where a city where there is a lot of money made that can basically bridge the gap for a community that has less.
Sandra, it's amazing that you talked about big bellies. I've bought big bellies and put them out on the street before. They're pretty awesome little pieces of equipment for a trash can, but a solar powered trash can.
Yep.
All right, my question will be for Jatish. There's an underlying concern that while technology is evolving to meet the needs of tomorrow's systems issues, the actual infrastructure for energy, water, and transportation isn't. It's legacy systems. Aside from additional funding, what can cities do today to help in this transition?
Beyond the kind of additional funding, sometimes it's a question of being able to essentially shift funding from one place to the other. I mean, in our field of transportation, every transport agency has been historically geared around road construction and adding more road capacity. But in the last kind of 20 years, national road capacity has increased by 42%, but vehicle delay has been increased by 144%. So it's not really working. And what we see in our sector is that a lot of gains can be made by refocusing funding on operations as opposed to road construction. So only 10% of transport spending is on operations, but operational issues and where a lot of the technologies can be really impactful are the root cause of around 60% of congestion. So where we see an opportunity there is being able to shift funding to operations quicker to generate benefits and can generate substantially higher ROI. The other factor as well, we see that the pace of technology adoption at the average transport agency or average city is extremely slow. And a lot of this comes down to one, attitudes towards technology, and two, procurement process. Things that we'd love to see on the procurement process side is shifting towards smaller initial pilots where agencies can test out technologies and with low risk, as well as relaxing requirements for competitive bidding processes to enable innovators to scale solutions that work. So for novel solutions, there really isn't typically straightforward competition, but they end up getting stymied by legacy companies trying to fit old solutions into the same process, and it can take months and months, if not years, to be able to get through that process.
Thanks, Jatish. That's really good. I think, Tiffany, you'd have some really good things to add here too as well.
Oh, I just wanted to add to Jatish's thoughts briefly around technology and operations kind of being, I guess, maybe more of an ROI investment for the city. I think that is one perspective. At the same time, I think if we don't do something really radical with the design of our city streets, I think we're going to have way more traffic fatalities, especially as autonomous vehicles start ramping up. I think it's an issue not necessarily of technology and whether or not things are connected, but whether or not the actual design of the infrastructure, the design of the street is built in a way that promotes the right modes, the most vulnerable modes above maybe, the most dangerous cars and trucks. So I would say that if you don't have the right operations without the right design, you're going to have trouble. And if you don't have the right design without the operations, you're also going to have some trouble. And I think I was absolutely tickled when I think Riley Brennan, one of the leading mobility VCs, he wrote in his newsletter this week that sometimes the bike lane is the best technology that you need in terms of pushing mobility forward, which I can't believe a VC said that.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I like to ride bikes. I don't ride them enough, but they are very important, and the bike lanes are wonderful. So Reza, why don't we go to you to wrap up this question? Your perspective on
I think that's actually a really great question, and I'm going to come at it and steal Tiffany's comment from the quote earlier, saying that you need bridging technology. That is a huge one. Not everyone will be able to take the leap immediately to jump into it. I would say there's a lot of things that can be done, even without huge levels of investment. One of the biggest problems I see to date is, number one, data collection. A lot of these legacy systems are just tossing out data because they don't have the memory and capacity to retain them. And number two, the worst part of it is if the data is collected, it's useless because it will take so much time to clean up and actually utilize, to make it valuable and utilized. It is almost impossible and better to start from scratch. So I would say in general, if they can begin collecting that information, structuring it in a way that is going to be helpful, tagging everything and organizing it, that's one of the best things they can do, because obviously that's usually what prevents people from being able to rapidly adopt solutions that will be valuable to them.
Bringing everything back full circle, talking about design, operations, and data, and bringing those three elements together really does put together the right formula for how to really move forward with the adoption of smart city tech. So thank you very much for that, Reza. So from here, we have a few questions from our audience. And first one we have is from Burak. So Burak is asking, considering the successful and unsuccessful smart city projects, how dense should a smart city be? I think it's in terms of how to apply the technology. So any indicators of what would be an ideal situation? He's mentioned in residents per square kilometer. So let's see, anyone want to take this on first? Sandra, would you like to answer first?
Sure. So I definitely encourage you to check out the City Signs project from the MIT Media Lab. They've actually worked on a lot of models where you can, put inputs around number of residents and then how many trips they make. So I think you can't really model just by number of residents. You have to figure out what all of the behaviors are. And I think, Tiffany, for example, measures how many trips and people need to move. And so depending on what jobs they have and where they live, a lot of those are questions, right? In a lot of places around the world, we did a big research study in Cape Town in South Africa. And the reality was a lot of people commuted each way an hour and a half. So that has a huge impact on how you're planning for that smart city. Now, I can tell you what my preferable smart city model is, which is probably more or similar to Paris, back to the small neighborhoods, which looks like a living organism where you have all the necessities within a walking or biking radius, and then you connect those hubs through public transportation like subways or autonomous vehicles or any sort of additional fleets. I think personally, I'm a big fan of New York. So I love dense cities, actually. I think collision is something beautiful and a lot of innovation comes from it. So I would hope that there's no one size fits all and that we just work on every city in its custom parameters and make sure that we set up every city for success and that we try as hard as we can to bridge the gap between people who are not as fortunate and privileged and then the ones that are, and make sure that we provide a happy, healthy city for everyone.
Sure. And I definitely think that, talking about density, it also depends on what solution you're trying to put into the market and apply and what that situation looks like. So it's definitely not a one size fits all approach. And to talk about just smart cities in general, there's so many different disciplines. So for example, we have 4 completely different perspectives here on the panel, and something involving energy and IoT might not be the right density for something on mobility and AI. So definitely different solutions for best fit. Reza, we also have another question on security. So we're talking all about how these technologies are really evolving and where they're going, but also there's the danger that comes with what happens if XYZ attacks it. So what are the top 3 potential security issues that you see with the rapid adoption of smart city tech and city infrastructure?
I really appreciate it. That's a really great question. I think that is one of the biggest threats to pushing forward smart cities, and that being startups, to be honest. Because smart city technology is getting pushed so fast, security is a nice to worry about if we survive topic for a lot of startups, because you have to take conscious actual effort into your design and components to it, which that's overhead that most startups at an early stage don't think about. And there is number 2, the second one is there's a lot of vulnerability in the gap between systems, different systems, and how they interact with each other. We've seen numerous ones, and they all have an impact on each other. So you can find ways, if it is not encrypted communication, standardized communication between various systems, there's an easy way to be able to get in. So people have to not just look out for their solution, but also everyone else's that they're connecting to, because there may be vulnerabilities all across the board. The third one being is you would be surprised what can actually possibly happen. I can't remember what store it was. Maybe for some reason I'm thinking Target, where they hacked into their thermostat. From their thermostat, they were able to collect all of the receipts and credit card numbers for millions of transactions. So if you have a weak area, it can get exposed and infect other systems. So you just have to be very careful and diligent about policies that are created, standards that should be implemented, which technically really don't exist right now, and find out more about the technology companies that you would be working with and how it can impact it. But I mean, from a smart city perspective, there's a tremendous amount of liability and danger that people normally have to take on in order to try new technologies that are on a larger scale. So doing the pilots, as terrible as it is helpful to prove it, whether it's going to be reliable, whether it's going to be secure when it's rolled out on a much more large scale.
Jatish, do you have a little bit of perspective to add on data security?
Honestly, no, I think Reza covered quite a lot of it there. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a bunch of different factors, but I think one of the things as well, I guess data privacy and data security is another big area. But I guess that's something that we try and avoid thinking about, just because we don't want to have personally identifiable information because of all of the different security issues that that brings. And it kind of fits in with our own ethos about being agnostic to being agnostic about not discriminating between different types of people or whatever, and just really being agnostic about just letting flow be flow, and people getting from A to B regardless of who they are or where they're going.
Definitely. And I think this is a really good place to wrap up our conversation. And there's so many really great ideas and thoughts to really think about that we could take away from our discussion this evening, and talking about where is it that we're going in general, no matter if you're in a big city or small town America or somewhere else in the world, and talking about these technologies and why they are needed now, and what type of difference, and how will they help people moving forward as cities evolve is a conversation that's ongoing. So I really think that we covered a lot of bases this evening, and really appreciate all of you sharing your perspectives. Before we go, just a little share on a couple of our upcoming events. So I'm going to bring that up. Yeah, it's not coming up. All right, so we have an event next week on venture capitalists. So we actually have one of our panelists joining us this evening, Josh. So if that's something of interest, bonrun.co/events. And then we're also exploring Silicon Valley Tech on September 15th. So really interesting stuff coming up. But again, thank you so much to our panelists and to our co-hosts this evening, Dave, so Reza, Jatish, Sandra, Tiffany, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Really appreciate it. Hope that their perspective gave you a lot to think about regarding smart cities and where we're moving forward. Please keep in touch. For those of you who registered, you will get this video in the next couple of days, pending Zoom and how the recording system goes. But otherwise, we'll see you around, and thank you all again.